Was Paul's sermon to the Greeks in Athens a success or a failure? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we continue in our study of the book of Acts entitled The Spirit and the Church, the Faith of the Earliest Christians. And today we come to Acts chapter 17 and 18, chapters that deal with Paul's second missionary journey. And to help me talk about what happens in these chapters, I've invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Dybdahl, to join us here for Theology Sabbath School. So Dr. Dybdahl, welcome again to Theology Sabbath School. I hope your courage is up as we approach Thanksgiving.
I'm hanging in there. Thank you. It's good to be here.
So in our lesson today, we come to the second part of Paul's second missionary journey. We saw last week that he went to Philippi, and today we look at his ministry in the city of Thessalonica, and then eventually in Athens briefly, and then in Corinth. Dr. Dybdahl, what strikes you as some of the key highlights of the stories in these chapters?
Well, if you're thinking of, you kind of gave an overview of these, the places, various places that he goes. It's interesting to me how when I hear about Paul's missionary journeys, I had always imagined kind of a planned out itinerary where he's going to spend a certain number of days here. He's going to, preach a series of meetings, and then he'll move to another place and another place. And as we read these stories, this second missionary journey, and it's true of his other missionary journeys, it sort of fits and starts, so to speak. He might spend a fairly short time in one spot, and then, for example, in this second missionary journey, he ends up in Corinth, and he spends, about a year and a half in Corinth, some length of time there. And so and oftentimes he moves from one place to another based upon the opposition that seems to arise, more than that he sort of planned out his schedule perfectly as to where he will be when. He has to be flexible, he has to be nimble, as his preaching and as his presence creates controversy. So that's maybe something that stands out to me, not just from the second missionary journey, but his travels in general.
Remember we talked about this same point, Acts, I think 7 and 8, when Dr. Thomas was our teacher several weeks ago. And we talked about the kind of spontaneous growth of the church because it was the persecution of Stephen that led to those Greek believers fleeing from Jerusalem. And wherever they went, they took the gospel with them. So you do often think sometimes that, we have to have all the plans and the strategy, and we got the points on the map from point A to point B. And sometimes God's work just has an organic growth, and we don't contribute much to that. God just kind of opens the doors when they need to open. So I'm curious though, when you look at these chapters, we talk a lot about Paul, but do these chapters give us any type of insight maybe into Paul's personality?
Yeah, I think they do actually, and this was something I didn't expect to kind of be drawn to this subject. So when I discovered that I would be participating in this discussion on Acts 17 and 18, I just start by reading through the chapters and kind of seeing what I've talked about these things before, but I wanted to give the idea for a fresh thought. And this was kind of the thing that I spent a fair bit of time on, is noticing how these events, and not just in these two chapters, but these two chapters I think got me thinking about this, how the stories in Acts, how revelatory they are about Paul's personality. And I started a little list of things, and I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just criticizing Paul, because I think Paul is, it's a wonderful name for one thing, and he was certainly a influential and wonderful and godly man. But here's some things, and you can correct me as I go through here if you'd like, or add or subtract. But it seems to me like, again, not just limiting myself to Acts 17 and 18, but as we look at Acts, that Paul really was someone that I would call quite opinionated. He had beliefs, he had opinions, and he did not tend to waver much from those. And I'm thinking, for example, of what we talked about last week with the split between Paul and Barnabas. Paul does not feel that John Mark should be traveling with them. And this was a point on which he would not budge. So there's a certain level of, like, I would use the word opinionated. And of course that can be, that's not just a negative, that could be a positive. He's incredibly zealous, and he uses that word to describe himself even, but it seems to me like Paul is a 100% sort of person. When Stephen is being stoned, Paul is there giving approval of his death. When there's the change in his life, the calling from God as a result of the Damascus Road experience, when he meets Jesus, he's like 100% then for Jesus. So he's a 100% zealous kind of person. I thought about his confidence, and there was kind of a confluence of things for me this week in my own personal devotional time. I happened to be reading from Galatians, and so it struck me what Paul says there in Galatians. If someone else comes preaching a different gospel, and he says, even if it's an angel out of heaven, an angel from heaven, if it's a gospel different from what we delivered to you, let him be accursed. And the Greek there is anathema. And I was thinking, what sort of confidence is exhibited in that he would say, even if an angel from heaven were to preach something that disagrees with what I presented, let him be accursed. It's like, this is an incredibly confident man. Did you want to stop me yet, or ready for, I'll just keep going? Any corrections or?
No, I think it's great. I mean, this is what we see, and I would agree with every point that you've said so far, and I think I like how you qualified it by saying that it's not necessarily negative to say someone, is this way, because certainly God is using those traits, because if you didn't have that kind of personality, there's no way you would be able to be beaten in Philippi, run out of Thessalonica, running for your life from Berea. It takes a tough, thick-skinned person to do that kind of work.
Yeah, and actually, you didn't really steal my thunder, but I was going to at the end try to draw some lessons from that, and you gave us a good start on that, Carl. So I had opinionated, I had zealous, I had confident, and it seems quite plain to me that he is also a polarizing figure, quite a polarizing figure. So I'm going to just reference a couple of passages here from chapter 17. Like, Paul goes somewhere, and he really does seem to be the figure that he brings controversy when he comes. So verse 10 of chapter 17, as soon as it was night, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. So you have, it doesn't sound so much like Paul necessarily wanted to go, but there was enough trouble that was brewing there. The brothers were like, it would be best while it's night, go ahead and head on your way. And then just a few verses later, in verse 14, the brothers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. So time to move along, perhaps. Time to move along. I said polarizing figure. I'll mention maybe one more. Paul was also an emotional person. He felt things. He felt things in the controversy or debate with Barnabas. He was provoked. And when we read about his arrival in Athens, as he walks through the city and he sees all the idols there, there's this same word again. He is provoked by the idols. He feels something well up within him. It's a strong emotion that then leads to some action. So these are qualities about Paul that aren't necessarily bad qualities, but I think that it would have made it difficult sometimes to get along with Paul. And again, that's not a bad thing, but maybe the lesson might be, and you kind of said it already, that God uses all sorts of different people with personality characteristics that might not always mesh real easily with us, for example, might be different from us. The people that God uses may not always be the most diplomatic. They have strengths, they have weaknesses, and that's okay. In fact, that's even a beautiful thing, that God could take someone like Paul, and therefore someone like this Paul, and therefore someone like Carl, and therefore someone like any one of us. With our strengths and our weaknesses, God could take us and still use us in his cause. So I like that about this reflection on Paul's personality.
Yeah, those are I think some great lessons to draw from that. And it's interesting to remember, because you kind of describe it, and yet it's the same person who talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And the first one is love. And the great chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, the same apostle who tells the Corinthians that they should, if eating food offered to an idol would make a brother stumble, then I'll never eat it. So he's a person, like you said, tough character, yet a heart on the inside that's been softened by God's grace. And that doesn't mean we're always soft all the time, but it means that God had grabbed his heart and transformed this man from a persecutor to the great Christian apostle of faith in Jesus and of love towards one another. What a transformation, truly a transformation. We come to this speech, we mentioned it here at kind of our lead-in question. Paul is run out of Philippi and then taken out of Thessalonica, and he comes to Athens. And he has this speech where you mentioned already, he goes and he sees, this statue to the unknown God, and he uses this as kind of the launching point for this speech to the leaders of Athens. Was it a success? Some people say it was a failure. Maybe you can you kind of fill in the details of why someone might even think it was a failure instead of a success?
Well, I've heard this question discussed before, which was kind of a surprise to me. Like I was reading, I'm thinking just as a young person reading through Acts, and always found myself really intrigued by this speech, and felt as though, it was a success. This was a tough audience, and there were people who believed. It mentions men and women, and it mentions two people in particular by name who responded to what Paul said. And so I always thought of this as, wow, that would be, this is great that this was able to take place. And then the things about the speech that I appreciated, I realized for some people were controversial. And I think you're going to ask me some questions, maybe more particularly about that, so I won't say too much about it quite yet. And that because of that, some of those potentially controversial things that Paul says or does in his speech, that some people have said, well, actually, he was trying a kind of new technique, but it didn't work very well. There were only a few people that responded, and so this was a failure. And he learned from it, and then moving forward determined kind of that he was going to stick with the tried and true sort of message that he would give about Jesus. I suppose those that watch this and maybe in live Sabbath school classes that have a chance to discuss this, there may be a difference of opinion, but from my perspective, I see this as something valuable which he did. I don't think it was a mistake, and the response from the audience, although we can't judge everything from that, I think the response from the audience was positive. So I would see it as a success. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask what you think, Carl.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've articulated the issue quite well. And the passage that most people will go to talk about this being not a success is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul writes, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And so this is significant because Corinth is the place he comes after being in Athens. And so here the idea is that he says, I've determined now to only know Christ and Him crucified, which is interpreted to mean that he tried a different message, a different way in Athens. I'm with you on this. I don't think that his mission there, his sermon was a failure. In fact, I was in Greece on a tour I led several years ago now, and we had a Christian who was with us, who worked as our official tour guide, and we were talking about this, and she had said, you know, the reason I'm a Christian today is because of Paul's speech, because what he said took root in the hearts and lives of a small number of people, yes, but, you know, God likes small beginnings, and it led from that small beginning to a great movement of faith in Athens. But I think maybe what we need to do, Paul, is before we kind of jump, you know, to the conclusion, is to go back and maybe talk about questions that could help us evaluate this perspective. Because there may be some who's like, you know, I'm not sure I agree with you. But maybe we could start by talking about who's his audience, and then how does he try to reach them on that basis?
Yeah, so his audience is named here in the chapter. Paul begins to speak. He begins to preach in the marketplace, the agora. He actually also visits synagogue in town and begins to kind of create, people are wondering what's happening. And he's talking about the resurrection, Jesus and the resurrection. And people are curious. And there's a group of people, philosophers, Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, who love to debate ideas, and they invite Paul to address the Areopagus, which would have been kind of the rough equivalent of, I don't know if I should say equivalent, but this is like the primary sort of religious and philosophical, we might say, gathering in the city. And at least to some degree, we're seen as sort of guardians, more or less, of the religious thought of the city. So this is a very august group that Paul is invited to address. And if you have a study Bible or you have a commentary, you will probably be able to read quite a bit about Stoic philosophy and Epicurean thought. There's a lot that's been written. I don't know that we need to go into that a lot. But Paul is addressing a group of thinkers, of educated people, the intelligentsia, so to speak, of the city. And apparently the custom was when you were invited to address the Areopagus, you would have a day to prepare, and the expectation is that you would prepare your remarks, and there's kind of a standard expectation of how you would address the group. There's like the salutation, the opening, and then you share the content, the points of your speech with a conclusion. It's a little more complicated than that. But Paul follows that. When we look at his speech here, he follows along with that expected way of addressing the group. And once you had prepared that speech, you're expected to memorize it then and be able to just share with the group from memory. And by all accounts, that's exactly what Paul does. He he follows along with their cultural expectations about how to address this significant group.
So how would you say then he addresses them? So that's like his audience. So this is the intelligentsia, but how does he craft his message then?
Yeah, it's interesting to note for me, and this is now moving in the area where some people find some controversy. In this address, he uses sources that might be problematic. Were we to kind of contemporize, that's not a word, make a contemporary kind of equivalent today, because he does not overtly quote from the scriptures. Obviously the content, he talks about God as creator, he talks about the resurrection of Jesus, so certainly these are, biblically supported themes. But when he quotes from the sources that would have been familiar to his audience. So I jotted this down. One of his quotes: "In him we live and move and have our being." This is from the poet from Crete, Epimenides. It's not from a accepted scriptural source from our perspective. And then he also quotes from Cleanthes's Hymn to Zeus. Again, these are Greek writers. Hymn to Zeus, he quotes from. "We are his offspring," this phrase that Paul uses. And he uses these quotes from their sources to support a point that he is making about the nearness of God. And so this would be, you ask, how does he address them? He addresses them in a way that's relevant to them, using sources that would have been known by them and significant for them. It would also indicate that Paul himself then would have to have been familiar with sources that were not, they were not Jewish, that were not Christian sources. So I don't know if that kind of addresses your question, I think, at least a bit, Carl.
Yeah, it does, because it shows that he's just trying to make a connection. And to me, it just seems like the basic, 101 speech class, college speech class, which is you have to connect with your audience. And if Paul was to start talking about circumcision, they're like, what are you talking about? So he tries to find a niche, an access point where he can catch their attention. And it's true that he does quote these poets instead of quoting a passage of scripture, but is his speech really a non-Christian speech?
No, this is a Christian speech, of course. It's a message about God, it's a message about Jesus, but he uses, I'm just repeating myself, I guess, but he uses sources that would be familiar and respected and to or by his audience. And this is actually something that I think Christian communicators today struggle with to some degree. I feel like, partly because of my age, but also just the way I've chosen to live my life, I feel that I've lost touch to some degree with surrounding culture. So if I were asked to address a group of people who are not familiar with the story of Jesus, I would find myself very nervous, and I would be struggling with knowing how to connect with that group. I'm much more at home with people who are familiar with the same scriptures that I'm familiar with. So this is kind of a, wake-up call, but I think what Paul does here should challenge us not to simply buy in to what the culture around us is saying, but to at least maintain some kind of connection with the people around us, so that we can connect with them in ways that would be relevant for them.
I think that's a powerful application. And I don't think there's any point, Paul, in this when you'd say that somehow he watered down the message, because even in the end, he talks about God the Creator, a day of judgment, and then it mentions that when he brings up the resurrection, then those intelligentsia, many of them were like, They begin to mock him. This is ridiculous. But there is no point in time where he tries to soft pedal that. I mean, he actually preaches the gospel to a group of philosophers in Athens, the home base of philosophy. And to me, that's quite a significant accomplishment.
Sometimes we confuse relevance with like watering something down, and I think it's just the opposite. The whole purpose of being relevant is not to water down the message, but so that the message is clear and powerful for people. That's what you're striving for with relevance. So absolutely, he's not afraid to offend them, but he's not afraid to offend them, but he wants to communicate, I think, in a way that they will be offended about the right things, actually, that they not be obscured or not see the message as just irrelevant to them. It means something to them. That gives the message a chance to convict and also to offend. So yes, I'm just trying to sort of repeat the same point that I heard you making.
I'm curious because your background, where you spent most of your time working on your advanced degree, is in the area of missions, and I mean, isn't this passage like key to mission philosophy? Maybe you can say a little bit about that. At least it seems to me like it would be really important.
Yes, yeah, and some of what I've said already, is that's sort of the subtext of it. I'll mention a couple other things, and one is, it seems like a small thing, but leading into the speech, it says Paul he's walking around Athens, and he's observing, he's listening, he's watching, and that's a key. It's very, very simple, but seldom done adequately, I think, is that when you have a message to share, we're so excited sometimes about the message that we can't hardly contain ourselves and we want to share immediately. But the discipline of spending time with our eyes open and our ears open, watching and listening to what's going on around us, then allows us, I think, to speak to the issues and in a way that will be able to connect with the audience that we're seeking to connect to. So just the principle of listening. And then the other thing I was going to note here, and I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but the other thing that I would note here is actually that Paul emphasizes something content-wise in his speech that I think we often neglect. When I've heard presentations of the gospel to someone who maybe is unfamiliar with it, it seems to me like we emphasize how sin separates us from God. So we'll say things like, well, we'll just flat out, your sin separates you from God. And we even will depict this sometimes with the human being, here, and then there's this huge gulf between them, and then God is on the other side, and like there's no way that we can get over to where God is. And then we draw a bridge, usually it's the cross. I think many people may be familiar with this sort of scheme. And there's certainly an element of truth to that. And that's using certain passages from Scripture. But in Paul's sermon here, he emphasizes another truth. And he emphasizes the nearness of God. That God is all around us. That God is with us. And it's not just in this speech, but elsewhere in the book of Acts, where we hear the apostles reminding people that God sends rain and sun and fills our hearts with joy. These are the things that the preachers of the gospel said to people that we would consider heathen or pagan. And I find this a beautiful message, and one that we should attend to. That yes, there's a sense in which sin separates us from God. But God also is very near, even among people who are unaware of Him, who don't know the story of Jesus. Jesus can be very close. And I find that personally to be a very moving and affirming and important message that we sometimes neglect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's powerful. To me, there's just so much in these chapters, and that's just a little bit of chapter 17. We only have a couple minutes left, but I think maybe we can shift a little bit to chapter 18, which is a powerful chapter. Again, there's so much in Scripture, we could talk a long time about it. But in chapter 18, we meet a couple in Corinth. Mentioned first in chapter 18, Aquila and Priscilla, later often referred to as Priscilla and Aquila. This husband-wife team of Jews, believers who come from Rome. And it's interesting because we know the dates when they came to Corinth, because they mentions here that they were kicked out of Rome, and we have the date in Roman history, and we know who the governor is. We can date it there. So these events take place around the year 51. We could talk about what takes place in Corinth, but what I want to talk about is a passage, Paul, that often gets overlooked. And that's after Paul leaves Corinth, about 18 months later. He takes with him Priscilla and Aquila. They go to Ephesus. And then Paul leaves Ephesus and goes back to Antioch in Syria. And this couple, Priscilla and Aquila, stay there. And they actually meet a man named Apollos, and they begin instructing him in the gospel. And they notice that he was a great preacher, but he wasn't quite getting his theology straight. I'm just curious if you might have any thoughts on the nature of their interaction with Apollos and how they encouraged him in his theological perspective.
Yeah. So you set it up beautifully, leading right up to the passage. And I'll just pick up here, Acts chapter 18. He, that is Apollos, had been instructed in the way of the Lord. He spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. So clearly there are some, he doesn't have a complete sort of knowledge. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, I love this, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. Two things that I'll note about this little story. And that is, the first one is a minor point, but I want to make it. I've heard discussions about whether or not a woman should ever instruct a man. Are you familiar, Carl, with this sort of these questions that circulate from time to time? And I'll just note here that we have Priscilla and Aquila. They invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. It's a small point, but it seems to me that here we have an occasion where a wife and husband team, and they're named in that order, the wife and the husband team together, male and female, they work with Apollos to instruct him more fully in the way of the Lord. So maybe it is possible for there to be women teachers as well as female teachers as well as male teachers. Okay, the main point here for me is I just find this beautiful. Here is a man who's sincere but has some gaps in his theology. Rather than attacking him, rather than starting a blog to publicize his errors, rather than assuming that he's a bad man, they see the good in him, they see the sincere heart, and they do this simple and beautiful thing. They invited him to their home. Fellowship, relationship. And they explained to him the way of God more adequately. What would it be like if, when we came across someone that we thought was lacking in their theology, they'd left important stuff out, if we would take a similar approach? Come into relationship with them, invite them to our home, show hospitality to them, and then talk about the way of God in a way that we could probably both grow in those kinds of interactions. So that was my little speech connected with chapter 18 and Priscilla and Aquila.
I think that's a great speech and a great place to draw an end to our lesson. Our time's already up. Hard to believe it's gone by so quickly. But two powerful stories illustrating the importance of connecting with others, both of them about connecting with others, learning to speak their language, and to help them come to faith in Jesus Christ. And I would say both of those experiences were a success. And by God's grace, may we have that same kind of charity towards others. So Dr. Didwell, thank you for an excellent lesson again. And also special thanks to Parker LeClaire, who's our cameraman today, and also Alex Paxa, who puts all the pieces together as our program manager. And also to you, our viewers, for tuning in. We hope you found encouragement, some new perspectives perhaps, on some of these very familiar stories in the book of Acts. And as we end with that theme of fellowship, it's a great way to conclude because we are just a few days away from Thanksgiving. And it's our hope and prayer that you might know that kind of fellowship with family members and others as we celebrate Thanksgiving in 2020. So take care, God bless, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.